Hey, ladies and gentlemen, hope you all are doing well and having a good day so far. What I'd like to do today is take a look at Chapter 1 in the AP Bio curriculum. In Chapter 1, in this lecture, we look at the age old question, what's worse, a lecture or a lecture over video? Okay, so let's go and find out. We actually just jump in with both feet and ask the question, what is life? What does it mean to be alive? And the answer ends up being something that's multifaceted. So we can define life. Sometimes you can look at life and be like, alive or not alive. But non living structures sometimes have a capacity to act lifelike. Like I've got a strip of LED lights that can respond to sound or music. So LED lights aren't alive, but they have some ability to respond to their environment. So the best way to look at life is looking at what organisms do. One key feature of organisms is energy conversion. Photosynthetic organisms, like the plants we see there, can use the energy from light and convert that to chemical energy. We can take chemical energy from our breakfast burritos and use that to power thinking or movement. Okay. Organisms also have a capacity to rearrange matter or organize materials. You can take materials from outside your body and convert it to your body through a series of chemical reactions. Adaptation, that's about evolutionary change that occurs in populations over time. Organisms also have the ability to regulate, which is to control sort of metabolic processes. So let me see if I can move this here. Hey, there we go. You can see the jackrabbit's ears. It acts sort of like radiators. It increases surface area so heat can radiate off. Um, there's a mimosa plant. It has some ability to respond to stimuli. So if you touch it, the leaves curl up, which makes sense as a response. In case it starts to rain on the delicate fronds, the leaves can curl up so that they take on less water. Organisms have an ability to reproduce, so you make new generations. Now, this is not only about making cute little baby critters, it is also about new generations of cells. And that is also tied into this notion of growth and development. When each of us began our existences, we start off as a single cell. But then, over time, those cells multiply and divide, and you wind up with these more complex organisms that have collections of cells that do particular jobs, what we think of as tissues, organs, organ systems. All right, now we're going to transition into looking at some big ideas in biology. These are big concepts that sort of tie everything together. I think it's really, really helpful to approach your study through this context because being able to tie new ideas into sort of these major themes or these big ideas is helpful in terms of sort of organizing your thought. It's also really helpful because that's sort of how questions are categorized. There are certain sort of categories of questions, and when you recognize the big ideas those questions hit upon, it gives you an idea of what sort of answers to search for on the AP exam. So the first big idea we look at is evolution. Evolution sort of explains all this diversity that we see in life. So we see the cute little animal flying through the air there, and it is a sugar glider. Now, sometimes people may think it's a flying squirrel, but sugar gliders are organisms that aren't really closely related to flying squirrels, but have adaptations similar to flying squirrels. Now, flying squirrels you can find in many parts of the world, I think like North America, Europe. Sugar gliders, you only find them in Australia because sugar gliders are marsupials. Now, marsupials are not particularly closely related. They're sort of their own branch in the evolutionary tree, but they have similar adaptations to flying squirrels. So sugar gliders and flying squirrels aren't necessarily closely related, but again, they have similar adaptations. So what does that make you think? Why would two species not closely related have very similar physical features? Well, it suggests they may have similar evolutionary pressures. The environments in which they live may have some common features. So, evolution sort of gives us the context or explanation for why we see some of the things we see today. All right, let's take a moment to just look at this mousetrap. Now, the mousetrap is built to kill mice, but taken individually, the constituent pieces, well, don't serve that function. That little board there by itself just has fascinating graphics. The little yellow piece, maybe you could use it as a little miniature cheese grater. The spring, I don't know, could help open a door for you. This arm here, maybe it could be like a little cane for infirmed chipmunks. I don't know. But you have all these individual pieces. By themselves, they don't do the same thing they do when they're all put together. So when you create this much more complex structure, it does new functions like killing rodents. Okay. And that leads us to another key idea in biology. It's emergent properties. This is a big one. The idea of emergent properties is that as you put systems together and you create something that's more and more complex, new properties emerge. Classic example, sodium ions by themselves, it's a really reactive metal, right? It will catch fire in the presence of water. Chlorine gas, holy smokes. Elemental chlorine is poisonous, it'll kill you. But when you put them together, you can sprinkle it on French fries, right? So sodium and chloride combine to form salt with new properties. Life itself is an emergent property. Think about yourself. You're alive, right? You're alive, but what are you made of? You're made of a bunch of non-living materials. You're made of mostly carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Get a little sprinkling of sulfur and some phosphorus in there and some other materials. But by and large, you're made of just a handful of elements that are all non-living. But when you put these non-living materials together in a certain way, then life is created. So life, the whole subject of what we're studying, is an emergent property. Now, because of emergent properties, because you can build more complex systems to do new things, you sort of take different routes of study. When trying to look at systems, you can take a more reductionist approach or a systems approach. Now, the image on your right, that is the three-dimensional structure of a particular protein. On your left, all those individual dots represent individual proteins. And then the gray lines in between, that sort of network of connections, looks at the interactions between these different proteins in a cell. Okay, so if you want to study things, you can focus on a single protein. You can spend years of research focusing on the structure and function and how to manipulate that for a single protein. Or you can take a more systems-based approach to understanding this. The whole COVID thing is a fascinating example of this. You can look at more systems level data about infection rates in populations, or you can focus in on signaling pathways or the communication that occurs within cells to sort of trigger some of the disease responses related to COVID-19. So again, a reductionist approach is more narrowly focused on individual pieces, and the systems approach looks at how the different pieces work together to create these large-scale responses. So we'll look at stuff. A lot of biology is sort of reductionist. We look at the individual pieces, but then with each chapter, we'll try to tie things into the broader picture. Okay, out of all the ideas, the one that's probably going to be tied to most of the questions you see on the AP exam is this concept right here. It's how structure influences function. Structure is just how things are built, right? And then functions are what those things do. So how things are built is inextricably tied to what things are able to do. So if you look at the wing of a bird, the bones in that wing, there's a real thin layer of cortical bone or compact bone on the outside, and then a lot of it is this trabecular or spongy bone. Well, what that does is it provides flexible support in the bones, but it decreases the density of the bones. So by having lighter bones, it takes less force to push those little birdies off the ground. Here we can look at things a slightly different way. It's related to protein structure. So again, down at the bottom, you see the protein folded up into its three-dimensional shape so it can do something. Well, if you change the shape of that protein, then it's not going to work anymore, right? If you change the structure, you change the function. And here's a classic example, the mighty mitochondrion that we see here. Now, what is the function of the mitochondrion? please don't tell me it's the powerhouse of the cell. I mean, that's not a sufficient answer. Mitochondrion is important because what it does is it cranks out a lot of ATP. It gets that powerhouse designation because mitochondria produce a huge quantity of ATP for the cell. Now, if we look, a mitochondrion actually has two membranes. There's this outer membrane and then this highly folded inner membrane called a cristae. Well, if the mitochondrion's job is to crank out a lot of ATP, where might you guess a lot of those ATP are made? If we think about how structure influences function, if you look at those highly folded inner membranes, or the highly folded inner membrane, that's where the proteins are embedded where ATP is made. So this notion of structure influencing function, you have a highly folded inner membrane, so you have more surface area, so mitochondria can make more and more ATP. So structure influencing function, that's a biggie. All right, another idea. Life begins at the cellular level. Cells are really important because cells are where you take these non-living materials, these carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and you combine them in such a way that they actually create something that's more complex and takes on those properties that we described being associated with life. So the cell is the structure that, or the simplest structure that performs all those features that we associate with life. So there are different types of cells in a multicellular organism like us that do very precise tasks, sort of based on what genes are active and what proteins are being produced. Another feature of cells that gets a lot of attention on the AP exam is the relationship between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Uh, Prokaryotic cells, the older, more primitive cells that lack a nucleus, think of things like bacteria, and then eukaryotic cells, the newer cells that have a membrane-bound nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They have some definite structural and functional differences that we'll highlight throughout the year, but you're guaranteed to have at least one question on the AP exam comparing prokaryotes and eukaryotes. All right, there's an important connection between DNA and proteins. When you look at a person, really you're looking at a bunch of protein. And then the materials inside the cells that are doing a lot of the work, those are proteins too. So proteins build us and run us. Well, how do you know what proteins to make? That's where DNA comes in. So DNA is sort of a very well-known molecule or class of molecule because what DNA does is provide instructions for how to construct and operate these proteins that make us and run us. So we spend a lot of time second semester looking at this connection between DNA and protein structure and function. There is also an important connection between energy and matter. Energy is the capacity to do work, right? What the heck does that mean? It means to change things, right? So energy is this capacity to make change. And then matter is the physical material of the universe, right? It's the stuff we're made of, it's stuff around us. What energy does is provide the capacity to rearrange that matter. So what we're able to do is use energy from the sun that's traveled 92 million miles to Earth and use that to rearrange matter into us. You can take something that is literally outside your body. You can take an ear of corn, consume that, and part of that will actually become your body. So as organisms, we have this capacity to take in energy and matter and use that energy to rearrange the matter inside of us and run the reactions of our body. Let's see. Next big idea we're going to look at is feedback loops. One of the features of life is the ability to maintain homeostasis. Stasis means standing or staying. Homos means same. So homeostasis means maintaining constant conditions. Now, there's an important point to make. Homeostasis is not equilibrium. Okay. In actuality, we're at disequilibrium from our environment. Your body temperature probably doesn't match the environment's temperature, right? So homeostasis just means staying steady. So we have to maintain steady states for all sorts of different features of the body, whether it's body temperature, oxygen concentration in the blood, sugar levels in the blood, the pH of the blood, whatever the case may be. So we have very steady levels that we maintain. Again, it's not equilibrium. Equilibrium equals death. Okay, we maintain a disequilibrium from the environment, and we have the steady state. Now, this is typically done through these feedback loops, most notably negative feedback. Now, on its face, negative feedback sounds bad, But in reality, it's really important because negative feedback is what typically maintains homeostasis. Now, it does this because whatever end product ends up getting created will actually inhibit its own production. So if we look at this feedback loop that we have here, let's say your body is exposed to cold temperatures. The hypothalamus up at the base of your brain detects that drop in body temperature. It stimulates the release of a hormone called thyrotropin releasing hormone, which goes to the pituitary gland hanging off the base of your brain. It releases another hormone, thyrotropin, that goes to the thyroid gland. And then the thyroid gland will go and release this metabolic hormone called thyroxine. What thyroxine does is it speeds up the rate of chemical reactions. One of the byproducts of chemical reactions is heat, so it warms your body. So if your body gets cold, it can respond by basically releasing a hormone that revs up your metabolism and warms you up. Well, what happens is thyroxine will actually inhibit the pituitary from releasing its hormones. Why would that be the case? Well, you don't want to overproduce thyroxine, right? If you overproduce thyroxine, you actually overshoot your set point. You'd overshoot your baseline temperature and you get too warm. So negative feedback is about maintaining homeostasis. And whenever product gets created, in this case thyroxine, it will actually inhibit its own production so you don't overcorrect. Now, we'll contrast this with positive feedback. The way I remember positive feedback, I think positive pushes away from homeostasis. So with positive feedback, whatever end product you create, it will actually enhance its own production. Okay. So a very common example with this is childbirth in humans. So late in pregnancy, the cervix, the neck of the uterus, starts to thin out or efface. When they talk about, you see in movies how many centimeters dilated is the mother. That's how open is the cervix, right? So the head of the babies are all head, right? They have these gigantic noggins. So this big heavy head starts to press on the cervix. Ultimately, that's going to lead to the release of a hormone called oxytocin. What that does is stimulates the uterus to contract. When the uterus contracts, well, what happens? There's more pressure on the cervix. Well, that causes the release of more oxytocin, which causes more uterine contractions, and you can see how you get this positive feedback loop. Again, you go back to experiences you may have in the movies that talk about how far apart are the contractions. Well, when the contractions get closer and closer in time and they last longer and longer, it's because positive feedback's been in play and you're producing more and more of these hormones related to childbirth. So the end product actually increases its own production until you reach resolution. The baby's born, pushed out, the placenta's pushed out, and now there's no more stimulus on the cervix. Other examples of positive feedback as it relates to the environment, you can look at temperature change. This is a rough one as it relates to the climate crisis. Snow and ice tend to be white. That reflects a lot of light, so the earth doesn't absorb as much heat. As that snow and ice melts and you have more water exposed, the darker water will absorb more radiation from the sun, and it will actually increase temperatures further. And so you get these feedback loops going where more water is created, it continues to increase temperatures. And as the water melts, it cuts through the ice, and the swift moving water melts the ice even faster, and you've got climate problems for real. Here in this last example, this is just a generic model. We have protein W converted to protein X, converted to protein Y, converted to protein Z. Well, Z will actually alter the shape of enzyme 5 to increase production of those proteins. So again, sort of a generic example of positive feedback. All right. One other thing to mention about evolution is that it helps us understand how life is related. There are 3 what are called domains. You may have learned like kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Species is the most exclusive group, right? Species are members of one group. They're able to reproduce fertile offspring with one another. Kingdom, on the other hand, is a big inclusive group, right? Well, we've stepped up another level to domains, and domains are the 3 broadest categories of life. Eukarya, that includes us. They're organisms with nuclear membranes and membrane-bound organelles. That includes plants, animals, fungi, and protists, little single-celled organisms swimming around in the water. Prokaryotes include bacteria and a more newly discovered group called archaea. Archaea, they're protists just like bacteria, and for a long time they were classified as bacteria. But what we found is that archaea has some significant but subtle differences in DNA and cell structure, and we're actually more closely related to archaea than we are traditional bacteria. Let's see. Again, looking at how life is related, there's this notion of natural selection and descent with modification. The idea with natural selection is that the environment influences who survives and who doesn't, and as a result, the population changes over time. So here we have this little herd moving along. More organisms around than can survive. There's going to be variation. Some are better suited than others, so over time, the herd adapts, the herd changes. Okay, and then what that can lead to is descent with modification. New generations come along with new traits, and if you change the DNA, you can actually change the proteins and get new things like purple potatoes, very high in phytonutrients. So if you can get your hands on some purple potatoes, they are the healthiest potato you can get. Would make interesting French fries, I would guess. Let's see, looking at how life is related. Unity in the diversity of life. I love that phrase. There's all sorts of diversity that we see, right? Think of the sheer number of different types of organisms, but they all have commonalities. They all have features that connect them to one another. And there's a cool example from your book looking at cilia. If you remember back to freshman bio days, cilia, they're little hair-like projections. You see them on paramecia, which again are little protists that you can find in pond water. The cilia will move along the outside of the cells, and the cells can swim through the water. Well, we also have cilia. We have cilia in different tissues of the body, including in our lungs. In our lungs, it's lined with mucus. So what happens is you breathe in, all the junk in the air gets stuck in that mucus, and now we've got mucus laden with pathogens down in our lungs. Well, we want to get that stuff out of there. So what the cilia do is they sweep the mucus up out of our lungs, the back of our throat, and then you swallow it down or you spit it out or whatever you do. Well, if you look at the cilia in our lungs and the cilia in a protist, and you look at an electron microscope image, you'll notice the protein structure underlying that, it's virtually the same. The same original structure that's been around for hundreds of millions of years has been adapted in different ways for use in different organisms. So paramecia can use it to swim around. We can use it to sweep mucus up out of our lungs. So relatedness of life, really cool example. Last idea we'll look at is this notion of adaptive radiation. So how do we get all this diversity? Well, you can start off with related species. So here you can see sort of the ancestral species. And what happens is as the environment changes, different subgroups may get separated off and they adapt in different ways. So I'm sure you've read about Darwin's finches and all that business. We'll look at other examples as time goes on. But the idea is you can start with a common ancestor and then adapt in different ways and wind up with organisms that are different using, their sort of ancestral endowment in different ways. All right, so that's it. Why don't you take a little break? You can go and text Grandma, see how she's doing, and then we'll follow up with the next video. Thanks a lot.